What's so interesting about that wiring harness, Tech?
It's the latest type, Kelly. It uses a new plastic insulation, for one thing.
Looks to me like the wires are thinner. What do you say, Scott?
Well, they may look thinner, Kelly, but they're not. It's only the plastic insulation that's thinner. Even so, it's more durable than the cotton braid insulation. The plastic retains its colors better, too. Grease, oil, and heat won't fade or discolor it. More permanent colors sure help when you trace out a circuit.
Yeah, I can see that. But is this wiring the same size as before?
Yep. It looks smaller, but it's the same gauge wire we've always used. And it carries the same amount of current. Now, here's something else. This plastic insulation strips a lot cleaner than cotton braid covering. You don't have to scrape off that black coating anymore. That black stuff came from sulfur, used in making the rubber in the old insulation.
What's more, cleaner stripping means better connections. Clean connections keep down voltage drop and current loss. Another big advantage.
Sounds pretty good. But speaking of connections, these terminals are something new also, right?
They sure are. They're used in practically all but the generator and starting circuits. You'll notice two kinds of terminals, brass and tin-plated ones. On the brass terminal, the male part is like a blade. The female part has curled sides that put pressure on the blade for a good, tight connection.
A small dimple on the blade acts as an interlock. There's a special knack to joining and separating the terminals that Scott can show you.
Yeah, Kelly. You insert the blade. Then, with a little pressure and a sort of walking action, move the terminal parts from side to side until they lock together. To separate the terminal, walk the two sections apart like you joined them. You'll find it a lot easier.
I gotcha.
Incidentally, thanks to the cleaner stripping in these new design terminals, most of your connections can be cold crimped rather than soldered. On any connections you do have to solder, use only a solder gun. It's quicker, neater, and won't hurt the insulation.
Always be careful when you solder, Kelly. Too much heat will melt the plastic. However, the insulation's fireproof and won't burn up.
Okay. Which connections, by the way, will need soldering?
Connections in the starting circuit, for one. Also, connections in the neutral starter switch, headlamp, generator, and primary ignition circuits. The other terminals are cold crimp.
I see. Now, what's different about the tin-plated terminals?
The male blade's longer, and it has a raised nib called a lance. You join and separate them the same way.
Tin-plated terminals are used in these new six-way polarized connectors made of clear plastic. On the back, where the terminal enters, each compartment is numbered, 1 through 6, for terminal locations.
Oh, it makes it easier to follow a wiring diagram, I suppose.
Right, Kelly. Now, you'll find these six-way connectors are used to connect the several wiring harnesses. First, they connect the body and instrument panel harness assemblies. Second, on all but Imperial models, they connect the turn signal harness with the panel harness.
That's clear enough. But what are those black jobs?
Well, these black plastic connector blocks make multiple connections. They vary in shape and have different numbers of terminals. You match up the shape and terminals with multiple terminals on switches and motors. By the way, there's something else that's new in the electrical line. It's a loop-type ammeter that you'll find on all 57 models except Plymouth. And here's that loop, Kelly, right behind the ammeter. This meter has no actual connection with any terminal, and still it does a good job. I suppose it sounds like magic, but it's true. A wire from the generator regulator passes through the loop. When the generator charges, magnetic lines of force from the wire make the ammeter hand swing over toward the plus side. If the ammeter reads in reverse or shows no indication, it's easy to correct. When you know the generator is charging, a reverse reading means the wire through the loop is reversed. Remove it and thread it through from the other side. No indication means either the generator isn't charging or the wire from the generator regulator to the starter relay is disconnected.
That adds up. But how do you check it?
Well, that's easy. First, be sure the regulator wire is connected. Then, get the tester and see if the generator is charging.
I see. If everything's okay, but the ammeter doesn't register, replace it.
Attaboy! Another new electrical feature, remember, is neutral push-button starting.
Oh, yeah. That's on the Chrysler, Imperial, and Dodge cars with torque flight.
Right. Now, we've got some service tips on that N button in case it ever needs attention. As you know, the starter solenoid circuit is closed by over-travel of the N button. In other words, after normal travel of the N button, for a shift to neutral, the end of the slide contacts a spring-loaded plunger. Now, this plunger bridges contacts in a switch to complete the circuit. Now, if the car doesn't start when the N button is pushed into the start position, you'll have to test the starting circuit with a test light. Now, here's how to do it on the Chrysler models. Connect the test light from the brown wire terminal of the vacuum lockout switch and to a good ground. If the light lights, you'll know the circuit is good to that point.
If the light doesn't light, I'd have to remove the push-button assembly and check the starter switch, I suppose.
Right. Now, there should be 10 to 15 thousandths clearance between the N button slide and the switch plunger.
And if there isn't?
Bend the flange on which the switch is mounted to adjust that clearance. Then the switch plunger will have the right travel to close the switch.
If the switch closes, but the test light still doesn't light, then I'd replace the switch, right?
Yeah, you'll find some tips along that line and the replacement switch package part number in the reference book.
Okay so far. Now, if you have a complete circuit down to the vacuum lockout switch, but the car still doesn't start, what are you going to do?
Test the lockout switch, I suppose.
Correct. So connect the test light between the yellow wire terminal of the lockout switch and ground. If you get a light, the lockout switch is okay. If not, you'd replace it.
There's still one more point where you might have an open circuit that would keep the engine from starting. You know where it is?
Well, let's see. Yeah, the neutral switch on the transmission.
Good. And you can check that by hooking the test light between the battery terminal of the starter relay and the brown-white stripe wire terminal. If the light lights, the neutral switch is good. Now, if the test light doesn't light, check the cable adjustment first. If that's okay, but the test light still doesn't light, replace the neutral switch.
Okay. I understand how to check out the push-button starting circuit on Chrysler now. But how is that different from Dodge?
It's no different up to the test of the neutral safety switch. Dodge, you know, doesn't use a starter relay. So your test light connection is made at the starter solenoid. Connect the test light between the battery terminal of the solenoid and the neutral safety switch terminal. That's the terminal with the brown and white stripe wire. If the light lights, the switch is good.
Better tell Kelly how to use the remote starter switch when setting timing or testing compression, Scott.
Yeah, that's a good point. If it isn't used correctly, it'll burn out the neutral safety switch. Here's how to connect it, Kelly. On Chrysler models, connect the remote starter switch between the battery terminal of the starter relay and the solenoid terminal. That's the center terminal with a brown wire attached. On Dodge models, connect the remote starter switch between the battery terminal of the solenoid and the starter switch terminal. That's the terminal located toward the rear of the car with the brown wire attached.
Okay, I've got that straight. What else is new?
Oh, there's a lot more, Kelly. But we better turn the record over now. Tech and I will want to talk about the backup light switch next. You know, Kelly, the backup light switch is mounted on the left side of the push-button housing on all torque-flight transmission jobs. When the R button is pushed in, a projection from the slide picks up the switch lever, turns it counterclockwise, and closes the circuit. If the switch ever needs replacement, remove the housing and use a long, narrow blade screwdriver to straighten the tabs that hold the switch. Remove the switch, replace it, bend the 4 tabs over, and put the housing back.
Pretty simple, Scott.
Say, Scott, while you're on the push-button housing, tell Kelly about replacing that bulb in there if it ever burns out.
Good idea, Tech. On cars with power flight and torque flight, remove the crosshead screws from the push-button plate. Lift off the plate and remove 2 or 3 push buttons for some working room. Reach in with the removing tool, remove the bulb, and replace it with a new one. Reinstall the push buttons and the plate. Check operation of the push buttons and light bulb.
Do you replace that bulb about the same way on the other models?
Yeah, Kelly, on all but the Imperials. The only difference is the number of screws that attach the plate and the screw locations. On the Imperial models, the bulb socket snaps into the rear of the housing. Just reach up behind the housing, pull the socket out, and install the new bulb. Then push the socket back in place.
I see. How about installing bulbs in other places, or replacing the Plymouth headlamps?
On those new headlamps, a large plate, called a bezel, serves as a door and support for the parking lamp. To replace the sealed beam unit, you remove 3 screws from the bezel. 1 screw is below the sealed beam unit. 1's at the top. The 3rd one is inboard of the parking lamp. Lift off the bezel and rest it on the front bumper, since the parking lamp socket and wire are still attached. Remove the screws holding the sealed beam unit. Replace it, adjust the beam, and then reinstall the bezel. To replace the parking lamp bulb, remove the 1 long and 2 short screws that hold the lens to the bezel. Replace the bulb and button her up. The lens on the Plymouth tail lamp and backup light are a little special. Both lenses are mounted in a rubber base. This base, in turn, is secured to the fender by built-in tapered rubber studs. To get at the screws that hold the lens to the fender, you go through the luggage compartment.
Yeah, I already noticed that.
Attaboy, Kelly. Now, you'll also notice that the lamp sockets are grounded to the fender panel by a separate wire. That's because of the rubber base mounting. To replace either the tail lamp or backup light bulbs, remove the 2 screws, 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom of the lamp. Then, very carefully, move the tail lamp lens from side to side to release it from the base flanges. Remove the backup lens the same careful way. Unless you take it easy, you might break off the attaching flanges and bosses. Replace the bulbs and reinstall the lens. Now, if you ever have to remove the rubber base, first remove the ground screw nut, disconnect the ground wires and the light wires. Then, as you press out the rubber studs, pull the base away from the fender. And to reinstall that base, you just push the studs through the fender holes until they lock in place in their retaining grooves.
Very clear. Was there anything else you wanted to cover?
There's a new electromagnetic fuel gauge, Kelly. It consists of a panel and a tank unit connected by a single wire and the new type terminals we talked about.
Yeah, and that panel unit has a thin coat of silicon dampening on the shaft pivots. That steadies them and cuts down needle wiggle when the gasoline surges in the tank. On all but the Suburbans, the tank unit is at the top and toward the front of the tank. A retainer plate and rubber gasket secure it in place. The outlet pipe is a part of this unit.
Is this plastic sleeve the new filter?
Yep. A washing action of the gas keeps it clean and prevents it from clogging up.
If the fuel gauge ever needs attention, you test both the tank and panel units like you always have.
Okay. There's no trick to getting the tank unit out, is there?
Not too much. Use this retainer removing tool to turn the retainer out first. It does the job without lowering the tank. And what's more, this new tool is a lot safer.
Yeah, Kelly. Don't you ever use a screwdriver and hammer to turn that retainer loose. One tiny spark and wham! The tank can blow up in your face.
I get it. One of those mistakes you can only make once.
Right. And always see that the rubber grommet in the floor panel's in place. The wire from the panel unit goes through there. It won't ground or short out as long as the grommet's on the job. I'd like to tell you about a mechanical item now, Kelly. It's the new sleeve-type power steering pump used on Plymouth and Chrysler cars with power steering.
What's it like, Scott?
We'll notice that it's combined with a reservoir and mounted on the left front end of the engine. It's driven by a belt directly from the crankshaft pulley. It has a greater displacement, puts out high capacity at low or idle speeds. Because of the greater displacement, a lower drive ratio of 1.37 to 1 is possible. This low ratio and resulting slower speed cuts down the noise level.
But you won't get full benefit from this new pump unless the belt is adjusted properly.
You're so right, Tech. In case pump performance isn't what it should be, belt adjustment is the first thing to check. To adjust that pump belt, loosen the bracket bolts holding the pump to the engine. There's a square hole in the bracket on some models, which permits adjusting the belt tension by using a torque wrench. instead of measuring deflection. So, engage the torque wrench in the square hole in the bracket. Tighten the belt to 45 foot-pounds torque on Plymouth, 90 foot-pounds on Chrysler. Hold that tension and tighten the bracket mounting bolt to about 20 foot-pounds torque. You got that?
Yep. I'll be sure to check it, Scott.
Fine. Now, if the pump sounds off, it may be due to a low oil level in the reservoir. See that oil is up to the level mark on the filler neck when the pump is warmed up to about 175 degrees.
Incidentally, always have the engine running before you turn the steering wheel. If you don't, oil will be forced out of the reservoir filler tube.
Good point, Tech. A level too high will also cause that, so don't overfill the unit. Another thing, pump noise can also be caused by air in the steering system, so check all connections to be sure they're tight. It may be necessary to bleed the return hose to be sure there's no air in it.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah. See that pressure and return hoses don't contact the frame or any sheet metal. Otherwise, a vibrating noise will be heard inside the car.
Okay, I'll watch out for that.
Now, two other causes of pump noise are a pulley that's loose on the shaft and water in the fluid. Another condition you might come across is hard or jerky steering at the end of a full left or right turn.
What can cause that?
A loose belt, Kelly, or dirt in the pressure relief valve. Dirt in the relief valve will cause intermittent lack of assist, too. You'll find the procedure for cleaning the relief valve in this reference book, Kelly. There's also additional information on all the things we've talked about.
Good. I'll be sure to study that book.
That's the spirit, Kelly. As everybody knows, we're way out in front with a terrific line of cars this year. In style, in performance, we're tops. Our big job then is to stay on top. Good service by master technicians will keep us on top the rest of the way.